This webinar is called Wellbeing, Why Haven't You Fixed It Yet? And I am joined today by Gethin, who I'll introduce in a second. So I'm Nick Court, I'm the CEO of the People Experience Hub. And I'd like to introduce Gethin. So Gethin joins us from Benefex, who's the Chief Innovation Officer, multi-award winning psychologist, 2 times Amazon bestselling HR author, and probably most exciting, certainly most recent, is UK Mental Health Campaigner of the Year 2023 and HR's Most Influential Thinker 2023, in there with some amazing other thinkers. I can only aspire one day to be there. So thank you for giving us your time, Gethin.
Yeah, I mean, I've probably outgrown you now, Nick, so maybe I shouldn't do these kind of things anymore, but no, it's a joke. Yeah, really happy to be here. Yeah, Nick, as you know, you and the People Experience Hub have featured in 2 of my books. So really think there's an important part for asking people what they think when it comes to wellbeing and asking employee opinions. So looking forward to this chat today. And I think it's appropriate because I think it's often missed. You know, courting that employee voice, pardon the pun, Nick Court, is I think a really important part of wellbeing, and I don't think we often think about it in a wellbeing context.
And I think it's going to be interesting. So we've got, I guess, if I go and have a look at some of the recent data that we've pulled out. So supporting employee wellbeing, we did a State of the People Profession survey out, before we came into 2023 and said, looking forward for the next 12 months, what do you think your organizational priorities are? Retention topped out at the very top, and supporting employee wellbeing came in at number 3. And I'm not surprised by that at all. And we asked people what gets in the way of delivering that. And the number one thing that get in the way of delivering that was good data, systems that don't enable us to get the data we need and all the rest of it, and budget. Budget is a big factor in that. But I think maybe the best thing to start is what is wellbeing? How do we define wellbeing? What's your view? Give us the world view on this.
So it's a really good question. And I was keynote at a conference for the pharmaceutical industry a couple of weeks ago. And after I did my hour talk, that was the first question from the audience: is how are we even defining this thing? And it's really interesting how the mass adoption of employee well-being, this kind of great amount of evidence that shows if an organization commits to supporting its employees, all these other things like shareholder returns and productivity and profitability, all those things will fall into place. And why I wanted to have this conversation with you is I feel like the whole industry's run away with itself and got a little bit confused and a little bit muddied, and it's a bit of a gray area. And part of that is illustrated by the fact I will still speak at conferences and someone will say, what even is this thing you're talking about? Like, I get why we need to do it, but I don't really understand what it actually is. And I think what's really interesting is if you look at most people's definition of well-being right across the world, there is no universally defined definition of well-being, let alone workplace well-being, because I do think they do slightly change. For my most recent book, I've dedicated a whole chapter to kind of how do we define it. And one of the really easiest, simplest explanations I think I can come up with, and this was informed by some different bits of research that I put in the book, is this kind of balance. If you imagine a seesaw, on one end you've got the resources available to you, and the other end, the weights are being put on the stuff that challenges you. And for most of the time, for most of us, we can deal with the challenges that life throws at us. But that seesaw will then balance, where if you don't have enough resources, and those resources can include things like financial resources, your social capital, so your social network, the people who are there to support you through things, your mental resources, your resilience to things like burnout and stress, and your propensity to get those, all of our levels of stress and burnout are very different. And so all these kind of resources you have available to you, and then the things that affect you. And if the resources are balancing quite nicely with the stuff that's going on in the world and in your life, you don't tend to see many problems. But when that balance tips, either we run out of resources, or there's a lack of resources, or the external or life pressures get too much, that's when we start to see problems. And I think that's, in the workplace, a really interesting way of looking at it. And then over that, there's this layer of actually, what do you need to be well in life? and above the really kind of, the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the basics of kind of food and water, basic healthcare, roof over your head. In the workplace, you start to see things emerging like, I work with people that I enjoy working with. I have people I work with that I can trust. I've got that psychological safety at team level. I'm being asked my opinion, and my opinion's been listened to. I'm being given opportunity to feed back on things. I'm getting regular recognition. I'm getting autonomy. I've got clear expectations from my manager. All these things start to fall into place. And I think what's really interesting is that the entire chapter of my book dedicated to that looks very different to the wellbeing industry that's been created, which is very much a app-driven, platform-driven, solution-based at point of crisis, rather than actually how do we support people with their day-to-day well-being before they even start to see that balance into living.
I mean, this is really interesting, because this is effectively what drove this webinar, which was like, I mean, if I think back before I did what I'm doing now, and I think back to, I spent time in Tesco, I spent time in Carlsberg, I spent time in Associated British Foods. Wellbeing was always on the agenda. Wellbeing was always a thing. And when I look at it now, when I first came into say measuring employee experience, measuring what's going on in the workplace, and we started off by thinking about wellbeing as a, how do we measure wellbeing? How do we think about wellbeing? And we looked at what was going on in the world, what was good thinking, and we said, okay, we'll look at the four areas that we think of as, financial well-being, physical well-being, psychological well-being, and social well-being. And I remember talking to lots of people about, loneliness is, kills as many people as smoking, and it's a bigger burden on the NHS than obesity, and yet, it's not a focus. And we kind of went on that journey, and then we developed our framework. And I remember Rob, who's our director of people science, separating wellbeing out into two things effectively. So wellbeing is an outcome, and then wellbeing practices. So how does an organization support wellbeing in the organization, as well as all the other environmental factors that you just talked about, like, manager skills, autonomy, and all the rest of it. All of a sudden, what we started to see was, when somebody can't cope with the pressures of work, when somebody says my resilience is low, when somebody's wellbeing outcome is dropping, we can flow that right back to organizational effectiveness. Process is not working, policies not making it easy to get stuff done, the tools not being in place, toxic environments. And if I pull up the insights report that Rob's team has just done, 59% of respondents said that their workload is manageable. Only 59%. But people who said that they could cope with stresses of work and they were able to cope with all that stuff said that they enjoyed being at work, that they were able to focus on their work rather than dealing with worries or hassles, that they believed the company's values and theirs were aligned, and they had great relationships or good relationships with their colleagues. And yet, and I think this is like, and I used to think I was too cynical on this, but the narrative feels like it's a supplier-led narrative, and that is a fix it at the end. Mental health wellbeing app, and
you get to point of crisis and then you intervene. That's pretty much what the market's been developed. And I think you talk about organizational structure and the way we design organizations as kind of being conducive or not to employee wellbeing. At the start of the pandemic, some really interesting research done by Berkeley University in the US found that actually burnout wasn't an employee's problem to solve. It was caused by the organization, and some of the things I mentioned, lack of structure, lack of feedback, manager relationships, overwork, all that kind of stuff. But resoundingly, one of the things that would buffer against burnout in the workplace, and the evidence still backs this up a few years later, is that social capital. So the more people you have in the workplace you can go to who can lift some of that burden for you, that can be a sounding block, somebody you could just moan to and just decompress about the day with and just kind of sense check stuff, that buffers you against burnout. And so I look at that and think, okay, well, you've got burnout as a big problem. There's some clearly things to solve there. Burnout didn't happen out of nowhere. I think during the pandemic, the idea was it was the pandemic that was fueling burnout, but actually, again, we know it's an organizational issue, not an individual issue, and you can put these things in place. But then we saw big employers around the world, like Nike, Bumble, LinkedIn, and others, who'd survey their employees, and their employees would say overwhelmingly, I'm burnt out. It's been a tough couple of years through the pandemic. I'm tired, I'm exhausted, I feel burnt out. And then their response to that was, in Nike's example, was to shut down their head office and give everyone a week off paid for free. And it made the headlines and everyone said, this is great. And then I look at it and go, but if we know it's an organizational structure stuff, people are just going to take a week off and go back to the organization that caused the problems without any changes. Now, I'm sure a week off is going to do some people good, even if it's temporary relief. But it serves to show us how we've created a market where you're like 1 in 3 people have got poor mental health, so we need to act, and all this kind of stuff. When, you know, we should have gone back, 5 to 10 years and think, what are the things that we could be changing? And the customers I work with at Benefix that committed to employee well-being and had all the right things in place before the pandemic took hold, weathered the storm of the pandemic. They didn't react to a change in circumstances. They were well prepared for what would happen, whether that's a pandemic, a cost of living crisis, or whatever's going to come next. And the challenge with that is when I consult with customers to try and get them to do stuff now that might benefit them in the future, it's almost like buying an insurance product for something that you don't know is going to happen or not. We can predict the future and say, actually, I think people's well-being temporarily is probably going to get worse because we're still dealing with the runoff of the pandemic and the mental health kind of echo pandemic of that. But how do you get somebody, like if I said to you, Nick, the chances of your house getting blown up by a terrorist in the next 5 years is fairly high. I think you should take out specific terrorist insurance. Most people are going to respond to that and go, I'm not entirely sure I believe that, and I want to see more evidence that that kind of thing comes to place before I do it. And I think in the workplace, that's kind of what people are thinking is, it's very difficult for us to show that we think these problems are going to get worse or the impact they're going to have on your business because it hasn't actually happened yet. But when it happens, we react, and that's crisis. And solving somebody who's in a crisis when it comes to their well-being is far more difficult than actually putting the preventative measures in place so that they solve the debt problem before it gets bigger, or we have some early intervention before they get a clinically diagnosed mental health problem.
I think when you were talking about that preventative stuff, what we have found, certainly in, if we're working, say, with food manufacturing or supply chains, so typically where there's deskless workers or dealing with machinery, one of the things we found is, and classed in amongst those wellbeing practices, is health and safety. So health and safety scores really well. It scores higher than any other wellbeing practice. And the safety of people, behavioral safety, training on safety, ensuring that people are carrying out their work in a safe way, that the environment is safe, that tools are maintained, is legislative. And people measure reportable accidents. You can go onto a site and say it's been this many days since the last reportable accident. So when something is intentional, either because you're told you have to do it, or because actually, that actually there's a massive impact, what we see is that organizations tackle that at the front end. You have health and safety managers, you have health and safety reps, you have health and safety meetings, and you have all of that stuff going on. And one of the things that puzzles me is we know that workload causes wellbeing issues. We know that it's a causal factor of somebody being unwell because of a work practice. And in terms of some of the numbers, so we asked people about being able to cope with pressure and being resilient. And what we found was people who said that their workload was manageable typically had a 6 percentage point increase on the average wellbeing score. People who said that they couldn't manage their workload in the time given to them, we saw a 28 percentage point decrease. What effectively that's telling me is, that small increase above the average is gainful. But actually, when somebody says that they can't cope, their workload is too much, they've got too much going on, takes away their focus. All that stuff we talked about takes away their focus from relationships. It takes away their focus from doing their job. It takes away their focus from their own autonomy. It takes away their focus. And what it does is, it drops that 28 percentage points is massive. And the other thing we've seen is anyone who works in an organization which has high purpose, so teachers, carers, so the NHS, doctors, firefighters, police, anyone who by default, the people care about their job, or people who by default have high purpose in their job will buffer that by fixing it themselves. They'll put the hours in themselves, they buy their own equipment, they, buy their own stationery, whatever it is, they buffer, before they try and say to the employer, you need to fix this, they try and buffer it themselves. And then that leads to burnout, and that leads to exhaustion, and that leads to other stuff. So it does feel like that if you want to solve well-being in the organization, having those apps and those platforms at the back end, we can't say that's not the right thing to do. Of course, it's a good thing to do. But if you're not also focusing on the front end, it's not a well-being strategy, is it? The strategy is a sticking plaster, not a strategy.
And I think these platforms, I think, have got a really good place, because I think if you look at the data around things like health literacy, people aren't in touch with their emotions. People don't really know how to best stave off diabetes. People don't really know what happens if you got a diabetes diagnosis, or a doctor had a chat with you and you get given one leaflet, and then you're going home and you're on WebMD and you're convinced yourself you're going to die soon because you're reading the worst examples the internet can throw at you. So there's an element of people needing to understand simple things like, even some of the heuristics we've grown up with. Is a glass of red wine a day healthy or not? Really simple things like that, where you can actually offload some of that information and get people to understand how they can make tweaks to their own behaviors and their own lifestyles that will enhance their performance. So they can start to see that actually stopping a Zoom meeting 10 minutes before the next one and listening to a piece of music, looking out of the window, going to make yourself a coffee, having a quick chat with your mum, all of these different things, they enhance your performance. And that's one of the missing gaps, I think, in the wellbeing market is it first of all plays on this idea that the reason why somebody's poor well-being is there is because it's somehow through their own fault. It's your fault you're overweight, or it's your fault you're in debt and you've got to get yourself out of this situation. Well, it's not as simple as that. Lots of reasons affect these poor well-being. If you look at mental health generally, from all the research I've done, around 50% of somebody's mental health is because of socioeconomic reasons. It's because they've been excluded from society. It's the way that we as a country or society treat them. So only about 50% can be altered through modifiable health behavior change. And lots of that is educating people about, why you should be going to sleep a little bit earlier, and encouraging people to do things like track sleep. So actually they start to realize that I had a really good day in work over the last couple of weeks. When I tracked this, my good days in work were related to the fact that I drank more water the night before than I did the day before, or I spent some time with a friend, or I worked on a good project and I felt a bit more fulfilled than I did the day before. And people start to be able to track actually their well-being is directly related to some physical things they can do, but also having a good interaction with a customer or a colleague, spending some time with your colleagues, doing something where you got to know each other, working on a project where you got recognized for the effort you put in. If your manager coming to you and say you did a really good job today, cancels out almost every bad thing that would have happened to you that day. And so when you put your head on the pillow, you tend to have a better night's sleep because you feel more like you've accomplished something. But again, that's not always spoken about. Purpose and belonging, as you've just mentioned. How often do you see that mentioned in the same sentence as well-being? And I have a lot of sympathy with people working in HR, because I think well-being has become so complex. If you've got a large, diverse organization, you've got a lot of different problems to solve, across various genders and generations. There are some differences in people's well-being and how they cope with things. And sometimes buying something is an easier way to try and solve that problem. But our own research at Benefex has found the same thing that you have, which is actually time, resource, and budget are the biggest blockers to doing what somebody wants to do when it comes to well-being. So that can't.
I'm just going to jump in there because, I've lived in an in-house role, and that time, resource, finding the cash to do something. It's almost like there's an education piece which says, actually, is the CFO and the CEO and the rest of the C-suite on board with what we're trying to do here? Because it feels like we have to move from, I worked in reward before, and, employee benefits had so much well-being space. And I always used to get gym discounts is a financial well-being benefit. It's not a physical well-being benefit. It gives a discount to people who go to the gym. It doesn't motivate somebody to go to the gym because you get 10% off at David Lloyd. So it's probably more of a financial benefit than it is a physical benefit. And I think there's confusion in that space. But it's a small part of the jigsaw, but I think in so many organizations it is the only part, it is the only jigsaw that they've got. And if people are not focusing, that says actually our strategy has to be multifaceted, it has to say this is the stuff that will get us through the next 2 years while we fix other stuff, this is the 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, this is stuff that we're going to do. Our strategy is to do no harm. Our strategy is the health and safety. Anyone who's worked in a warehouse or back of a store will know, you walk into the toilets and above the mirror when you're washing your hands, it says the person who is responsible for health and safety in this building is looking at you right now. And unless there's some creepy person standing behind you, you're looking in the mirror. And the message is to remind everybody you are responsible. And there's almost that strategy that says, you need to be able to switch off from work. You need to have the tools to do your job. We pay you for 8 hours. We want you to do your work in 8 hours. Now, on average, we know that on occasion it's going to, there's always something that comes along. We know that managers are going to be well trained and developed. We're going to update our systems, and I think about it, and I think in 1997, I was using a Windows 3.1 PC, and Windows 95 had been out for 2 years. And it costs a lot of money, doesn't it, to change wholesale architecture, systems, equipment that people are using, redesign the policies. But if your well-being is strategic and sits at the board level, and the strategy is do no harm, we do no harm and we support our people to be the best they can be, which includes being as well as they can be, then that flows through. Surely that strategy has to stop being about employee benefits and start being about longer term company goals.
I think what's interesting is in my world, which has obviously been heavily saturated in benefits for more than 20 years, and one of the core products that Benefits offers is benefits. We've got benefit schemes that we transact for now millions of employees in 50 plus countries. It seemed like boards got to grips with this idea that we needed to solve employee well-being. They become familiar with the research. The research is now so vast and compelling that we can say with a lot of certainty that the higher the employee well-being levels in your organization, the better the organization does by a number of different success metrics. So organizations and CEOs were like, right, okay, we've got to do this well-being thing. Now, where does this go? And we're still struggling with that. Most businesses don't have well-being teams or a well-being lead. They're still thinking, right, well, where does this piece go? And I think in our world, what's happened is the CEOs kind of said, okay, well, there's this HR function over here, and that's got a team that's got health insurance and gym memberships. And so this feels like it's well-being, so let's put that in that team. And when I really first started to get into well-being was because customers were coming to me, reward and benefit directors, who were kind of saying, I'm now a reward, benefits and well-being director. I've been given this problem to solve. And I kind of understood that, because for as long as benefits have been around, since health insurance was tied to work in America in the 1940s, the workplace has supported employee well-being. It's not a new concept. It's always been there. Getting people well, getting people treatment, getting them back to work as quickly as possible so that they can be as productive and creative and as we need them to be, has always been part of having employees, for almost 100 years now. And that allowed me to, and the whole benefits industry really, to react to that. So, if you look at most benefit schemes nowadays, right around the world, they are designed because of well-being. If you crunch the data we ran for 2022, 8 of the top 10 global benefits are all well-being related. If you ask people now, and our latest research is about to be published soon, if you ask people why you're running a benefit scheme, the answer is well-being. If you ask employees where they expect to get more well-being support, they'll say their benefit scheme. So those two things have become inextricably linked, and almost every new benefit that we add onto our platform is now well-being related. It's trying to solve one of our 5 pillars of well-being, which will be pretty similar to most organizations, I think. And as time has gone on, because of the pandemic, we've started to see that really come to life. So we've gone through what we refer to as this kind of benefits renaissance. So during the pandemic, we saw kind of a 20% uplift in interest in benefits like income protection. People started to realize, oh shit, if I caught this virus and I died, what would happen to my wife and kids, and who would pay the mortgage, and what kind of kicks in? And so, you saw this renewed interest in some of these stale, boring benefits like life insurance and income protection and critical illness, because people started saying, oh, do you know what? I probably need that. You know, these are protective measures that could really help me and my family. But at the same time, you saw a downturn in all these things, like even some gym memberships, because people just couldn't use them, obviously, during the pandemic. You know, on-site massages and all that kind of stuff, all the things. You know, so people really started to say, actually, there's benefits here that are really tangible and have real long-term positive impact. And then you've got some things that are temporary, and they might have been labeled as well-being, but you know, they probably aren't, or they're not certainly making a long-term impact on somebody's well-being. And so we went through this benefits renaissance. So you're now more likely to engage in one of our benefit schemes globally if you're a younger person than you are an older person. So that industry is almost flipped on its head. So when you look at things like income protection, some of these big benefits, these kind of big insurance benefits, our view for a long time was, well, you'd only be interested in that benefit if you had somebody financially dependent on you. So if you're married, you had kids, you had a mortgage, you might be interested in that benefit. But actually, you've got lots of people in their early to mid-20s who are saying, well, if my chance of getting cancer in my lifetime is 1 in 2, my chance of developing serious mental health is like 1 in 3, then this feels like the kind of product I should be taking. And so we've seen a big uplift in younger people taking some of these benefits. And so, you know, as far as I'm concerned now, if you took benefits as a concept, if you took well-being as a concept, benefits are a subsection of that. And I think for the foreseeable future, they always will be. And so benefits are playing an influential part in employee well-being. But in many cases, they kind of split between long-term preventative and short-term responsive. So, you know, lots of benefits are reacting to somebody who needs help, but they're also then providing some kind of long-term support. But again, what we're seeing is that needs to come with other stuff. There is policy that needs to be made. There are management training that needs to be reviewed. And that's where I really think the role of well-being individuals particularly should come in, where, you know, if HR rewrite a policy, is that being passed under the nose of the well-being lead to be able to look at this just with a well-being lens, to think, you know, what's the end impact on the user, you know, the employee, by changing this policy or updating this policy? And I don't think that's happening yet. You know, many well-being people I speak to are still largely responsible for communicating what the business does rather than actually making some strategic well-being decisions.
And I think that whole approach is probably a journey, right? And I think there's probably this maturity model that could be applied over this, which says, you know, where are you at right now? Maybe the first stage is you're reactive, and you're reactive to the problems that employees are having, you know, whether that be, you know, we're putting musculoskeletal support in, with physiotherapy access and benefits, we're putting, you know, pension in, we're putting, you know, other financial services in, and the next stage is getting better at communication. And I'm interested, because I was just like, while you were talking, I was pulling up some of the other numbers from our surveys, and you know, 25% of people said that they didn't know where to go with their employee to get mental health support. So they didn't know internally where they could go to get that. And what we saw was that when people feel that they don't prioritize employee where they feel like their employer doesn't prioritize employee well-being, we actually saw that overall well-being score drop by 29 percentage points again. And we see these perception, and I think you were talking about before, is like how I feel at work and how I feel I'm being supported and what's around me helps me to cope. And I was just, and I don't know if I can do this because I've never done this on Zoom, so you know, I feel like I'm old and clunky, but I'm going to share a screen. One participant can share a screen. I'm going to share.
We'll brace ourselves for the whole thing to crash. And we'll...
I know. So can you see that? Can you see the pathways to retention?
Yeah.
So one of the things that I've tried to do with organizations that we're working with is talk about linkages and talk about those linkages between the problems you're trying to solve here. So this is around intention to stay. So it's a retention pathway, and this is a visual representation of our framework. But if you flow that back from the outcome you're looking for is people staying in the organization, the felt experience they have, enjoyment, fulfillment, and pride, you flow that back to the environmental factors. These are the things that we say organizations can actually influence. You can pull levers, so they're building blocks. You can't tell people how to feel at work, and you can't tell people to stay, but you build the building blocks, and you look down at the organization actively supports the well-being of its people. It flows into enjoyment, it flows into fulfillment, and it flows into pride. And, there's not many that we see when we look at these pathways that do that. And you look at that and you say, it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? So when I am well, when I am able to, I can enjoy my work. I'm able to utilize all of my skills and knowledge because I've been supported to be well. And I'm proud to work for an organization where I see other people being supported, and I see other people, being supported by an organization that cares for its people. And therefore I flow through into that intention to stay. And I think that when we look at this, well-being is far more than just a single thing that happens in the organization. It touches so many outcomes that are positive. So the business case should almost write itself.
Yeah, it runs through the DNA of everything you do. It's not a collection of stuff you go out and buy. It's how the organization behaves and how everyone in the organization behaves. Two really interesting points from your data there, I think, is there are kind of two things at play. There's the individual's perception of, is my well-being cared for? And that's going to be through their own interactions with the business, right? So it was going to be what they see, what they hear, and their personal experience. So if they get a cancer diagnosis, if their parent gets Alzheimer's, if they've got double care responsibilities, if they fall into debt and they ask the organization for help, or they go to organization for support, how they are supported is going to really drive their vision of, does this organization really care about me? But they also see what happens in the organization. So they don't just see how you treat other people, as you found out. They see all these kind of signals from the organization, which is kind of, I'm getting the impression I'm working for a business that actually cares about people. And I think what you tend to see, and there's a model I pulled together for the book, which is kind of the employer brand type thing. So you get an impression from the outside in of what an organization might look like. So you could Google somebody now and you'll see on their news page or on their blog, we've just won Sunday Times Best Company to Work For. We signed this mental health charter. We've won these couple of awards for our approach to mental health, all these kind of things. And you'll start to look at this and go, do you know what? This is the kind of business that I think is going to take care of me, that prioritizes my well-being and will be there for me when I need it. And then when you start to you work in that business and you get the kind of employee experience, you kind of get that some of those things come to life. So you see the posters put up in the canteens or the workshops or whatever it might be. The manager tells you things. You see the company celebrate World Mental Health Day and Women's Health Day and Women's Week and all these kind of different things that start to give you the impression of the signals that actually, the promise that you were told at the brand point is coming to life in the experience. But then for some individuals, what happens is when they really need help, the business actually isn't there for them at all. So the substance doesn't come through. And there's some really good examples that have been out in the media recently where you've had employees that have got things like cancer diagnoses and being treated really unfairly by the business and dismissed and had to go take those businesses to court. And so, in some of those examples, they're businesses that have frequently won awards for their approach to employee well-being. But fundamentally, they were not there when the people counted. And so I think when we talk about things like well-being washing, that's really what we're talking about. Is if we say employee well-being is really important to us, if we say we put people at the heart of what we do, if we say that employee well-being saturates everything, and at board level we're saying, and we want to do this because we understand that gives us a commercial advantage in several ways. If we don't then follow through with that, if somebody phones us and says, you know what, my grandmother's just died and it's really bothered me, I can't concentrate and I miss her so much, and we go, well, your bereavement policy doesn't really cover grandparents, it only covers or your neighbor growing up who acted like a father to you, oh, but they're not your father and you've got a bereavement policy. Or examples that I've seen in my life with my friends where somebody is at their father's funeral and gets a phone call from the company during the pandemic to say, by the way, you're going to have to take a compulsory 20% pay cut throughout the pandemic, and just thinking, oh, they're at the funeral. Is this the right time to do it? And that same person being told, by the way, you've got to use annual leave to take off your father's funeral because we don't have bereavement leave in our business and stuff like that. And so it's like, it doesn't matter all those buying signals, all the things you told people, that brand, that experience, it doesn't matter if fundamentally people aren't experiencing or actually you care about me. And I think part of the reason why benefits is coming into life again is because they are the substance. That is the thing that will take place. That will give you the time off, that will give you the support, that will get you back into work, that will give you access to therapists, and that will kind of the stuff that actually makes a difference. But one of the things I do quite a lot with customers that I spend time with doing workplace wellbeing workshops is one of the first questions I ask is, if I stopped one of your employees on the street and said, who do you work for? And do you think your employer cares about you? What do you think they'd say? How do you think they'd answer that question? And I think to a certain extent, if somebody thinks they work for an employer that's going to be there for them and cares for them, it doesn't necessarily matter that much how you got to that point. You've got to the point where somebody says, yeah, do you know what? I saw the way they treated John when he had that diagnosis, and I was really pleased with that. And I think they really came up for him. So I believe that I'm working for a business that if that happened to me, they're going to be there for me too. And I think some of these things that employers can go out and buy and do, which might not have huge amounts of evidence to support their effectiveness, do a really good job of giving people the impression that you care. So they almost advertise and communicate well-being is important to us. And so we shouldn't discount some of these things because there's an important part to play there in visualizing well-being within your organization.
Definitely. And I think so much that whole piece around, not just how our employees treated when they need the support, but that visual, what do they see? What are those signals they see? And policies. I mean, the law of the land is the minimum required, isn't it? It's almost like, we require you to travel on a road and not go above 30 miles an hour, but also don't drive along it at 15 miles an hour either. And there's almost this guidance that says that. And sometimes work policies are a little bit restrictive because, and I used to get in trouble when I was a head of HR when we'd be talking about this, and I'd say, well, the policy's there to guide me as a people manager, as somebody who is here to support an individual, but the individual situation is the thing that actually is going to be the thing that I consider, that I work through. And it's so hard when you're dealing with hundreds and hundreds of managers who are having to manage policy and make sure that it's delivered fairly and consistently across an organization. So I get it. I get how challenging that is. But you go to that person that says, when I needed it, it wasn't the policy decision that that did the thing that the company supported for me. It was my manager who made a decision and was able to support you. Whether that manager made a decision by escalating or getting support from somewhere else is irrelevant. I was supported in my moment of need, and it didn't feel like 3 days bereavement is actually only for first level family members. Wouldn't really, it's about making that human decision. And one of the big findings that Rob's team pulled out from our surveys was the biggest area of work that people had to do on wellbeing practices was that people being able to focus on their work rather than dealing with worries or hassles is the biggest thing an employer can do, or the biggest area of improvement that an employer can make right now. Because, I mean, you think about it today and you think about the cost of living crisis, you think about people with mortgage worries, you think about all the worries that they've got in the world. And then they go to work and the equipment doesn't work. They can't park their car and the coffee's rubbish. It's too much. It's just too much. And there was a guy called Pete, I'm going to say his name wrong, Trundley, who was the main board distribution director for Domino's UK. And he once said to me, you've got to treat people well at work. You've got to treat people in a decent way because you don't know what's going on in their home life.
But I would add to that, if the organization can get to a point where you create this culture that somebody trusts you enough that they'll give you that truth, they will tell you what's going on in their life, we can better serve them. But we've got to create this culture of well-being to be able to get that kind of trust. So if I open up and say, I look at my own circumstance. So one of the questions I get asked quite a lot, people that do the kind of work I do don't tend to work full-time salaried at a business. So one of the questions I get asked quite a lot is, why do you still work at Benefix? And the reason is, an example recently was my mother got diagnosed with Alzheimer's last year. I took it really badly. The business's response to me was, you've done so much for us. We want to do whatever we can for you. You tell us what you need and we will do it. Like, there's no compassionate leave policy for this. If you need a week off, you take a week off. If you need longer, you take that off. You come back when you're ready. If we can speak to our providers and get you any extra support, can we get like an expert in Alzheimer's to have a chat with you? Can we introduce you to somebody? And I'm pretty confident now that if my dad phoned me and said he was struggling and needed help, I could cancel all my meetings this afternoon, rearrange them. And not only did my colleagues be incredibly supportive of that, the business would not blink twice and be like, do you know what, you're trusted, you're a high performing employee, whatever you need to do to be happy and healthy at work, we're going to embrace that and give you the autonomy to make those decisions. And that has created an employee experience for me that is so powerful. There is no point in me working for myself, because if I worked for myself as a self-employed consultant or I ran my own business, I wouldn't get that treatment. My well-being at this point in time, I would say, is better off because I work for Benefex. And so you mentioned about the do no harm. I think most businesses need to be getting past this from, we don't want to cause any harm, to we want to do better. Let's make sure somebody's well-being, somebody's life is better because they work for us. And I don't know the data and I don't have any figures to back this up, but I would stake my reputation on somebody who has felt like that, they were really cared for and prioritized in the company, will always do more. They will always put in the extra hours. The moment you said we need somebody to do overtime, they'd be one of the first to put their hands up. And I think we forget that. We forget that there's this two-way relationship in work where if we really help out people, they will really help out us as well. And lots of people want purpose. They want to work for a company that treats them well. They want to work for a business that prioritizes their well-being. I mean, our own data globally last year found that in 92% of employees globally, well-being, or approach to a commitment to well-being, was their number one priority when looking for a new role. So people are actively seeking out, the vast majority of people are actively seeking out employers that take care of them. So the next pandemic that comes through, they're working for a business they know that's going to be there for them, that isn't going to be treating them like shit or getting rid of them as quickly as they possibly can. You know, people want to work for a business where they're like, if I'm going to give my life and soul to this business and give them ideas and creativity, at the moment I can get pay anywhere. So I want to be working with a business that is going to give me a little bit more than that and really prioritize me. And I think that is why well-being has to saturate so much of what we do, because it's now becoming so much of why we go to work and what we expect of work.
I think that's amazing. And you know what, I get to speak to loads of people, incredible stories like that. And I'm a softie and I get those shivers. So whenever I hear stuff like that, I do genuinely get those shivers down my back that says, you know, that's beautiful. And kind of being able to work in that situation. And what's really interesting is if I think about my career, who I've worked for, it's been less about the organization's overall strategy and overall intention and more about the manager I've worked for, more about that manager doing the right thing for me rather than the organization. And I think ultimately there is always going to be that level, isn't there, where you say the person I work for is this, but actually you need that to be the organization. You need to know that anywhere in the organization, I think Rob talks about something which is well-being is a team sport, you know, and it is a team sport, and actually, you know, when you're at 120% and someone's at 80%, well, actually, do you know what? You've got two people that are giving you 100%. It's fine. Don't worry about it. You don't need to worry about that stuff, because there's always ups and there's always downs. And as long as what you're doing is, you know, create an environment where that's safe, then that's really important. And I think that you were talking about being able to do that stuff, and I'm just pulling up the numbers while you do that. So 26% of people that we surveyed, you know, across all of our surveys, said that they were not able to prioritize their personal well-being without being subject to criticism or scrutiny. 74% said they could. Now that's a great score, 74% saying they could, but over a quarter of the workforce said that if they focused on their own well-being, if they wanted to take the time, they felt that they would be subject to scrutiny and criticism. And that has to be company intention. That has to be as a company, we set an intention. We're intentional about what we're going to do around well-being, and we cascade that, irrelevant of managers' views, irrelevant of anyone's view in the organization. Give you permission. And that has to be explicit, doesn't it?
It does. And I think, so when I won UK Mental Health Campaign of the Year about a month or so ago, I only actually saw this morning the judges' feedback on why they gave me the award. And one of the things they put online was my ability to express my own vulnerability and set a precedent for others to kind of follow and share theirs. And I'm so super pleased that came through in the customers I work with who nominated me for that award, because it's what I've believed for a long time. You know, we have to let people know that well-being is part of your performance. You will not have high well-being. You not want to have high performance if you don't have high well-being. if you're not happy, you will not succeed at work. The first time I was ever quoted in a newspaper is because I've keynoted a conference for the first time, and I was talking about kind of why we need a great employee experience and the part well-being played with that. And I was trying to think of an example where if you didn't bring your whole happy self to work, how that would create a terrible experience for a customer. And my mind went straight to the quote happiest place on earth, and that was Disneyland. And I'd said at this conference, you know, if somebody was really struggling with something and came to work and they had to dress up as Mickey Mouse and deliver a great experience to a family that probably saved up a long time to have a trip of a lifetime that they might never do again because it's so expensive to do, and that Mickey Mouse was a bit pissed off, you can't afford to do that, right? You're literally going to ruin one of the most, probably for some kids, the greatest experience of their life so far, or maybe their entire life. And so you have to think about, in some of those customer service roles, it's really easy for us to think about, actually, yeah, if you're working at a cash desk, if you're on the telephone, if you're in customer facing role and you're distracted and you're dealing with something else, you're not going to deliver the best customer service. But those people who are distracted by life, or life is affecting them, are also not going to develop the best products. They're not going to innovate. They're not going to collaborate. They're not going to step up and help their other colleagues when they need support. Then, you know, none of those things are going to happen whilst people are really dealing with and struggling with life. So the more an organization can buffer against some of the worst things that life will throw at us, the more the organization will benefit. And I mean, some of the examples I'm seeing at the moment, which is like really leading stuff, is, you know, health insurance is a very expensive benefit, but clearly with the state of the NHS in this country, if you look at people buying private policies, the number one reason why people are buying private policies now is they don't feel like they can any longer rely on the NHS. Very complicated situation. I'm not advocating moving away from the NHS, but that's one of the reasons why private policies are being bought. I work with customers at the moment that are looking at rolling out fully paid health insurance to every single employee, which includes frontline employees on minimum wage. We've never, ever seen that before. Really expensive benefits, tens of millions of pounds to do this. But their view is, well, actually, not only do we create an organization whereby coming to work with us is giving you a significant leg up in some parts of your life when you compare to work with somebody else, but people are starting to look at, actually, do you know what? That's really going to help me out, because should the worst happen, even if I need some basic elective surgery, I'm going to be able to have that within a week, as opposed to 6 months, depending on where you live in the country. So well-being is becoming part of the deal, the reward, right? It's got, why would you come and work with me? It's because we treat people this way.
And actually, it's that, again, taking that total reward view, that whole employee value proposition, and what are you designing for something? I mean, we give pensions, so we fully fund the pension. So none of our employees have to pay into the pension pot, because, you know, I'm old enough to remember when pensions were, you know, defined benefit pensions, and then they moved to defined contribution. And we saw, actually, the minute that auto enrollment came in, we saw companies that used to have decent pension pots, that, you know, 10% contribution from the employer, suddenly became that 2 and 2, 4 and 4, 5 and 3, which is going to affect somebody in the future. There's a future problem coming. And one of the things we wanted to do was go, let's make sure that future problem isn't coming, or let's do what we can and, you know, fully fund the pension. And, you know, giving someone a benefits package where we say, actually, and part of our health support with you is you get a cash plan and a private health cover, which enables you to have a GP 24/7, which enables you to go and have not just physiotherapy, but like Reiki and other things like that. But, you know, but being able to go and have that stuff, you know, I know that, you know, someone in the organization needed an MRI scan, and they were able to get one through that scheme when they would have had to have waited. So they can suddenly do this blended approach where they say, well, I'm with my doctor, he thinks I need an MRI scan, it's going to take 6 weeks. Actually, I got it next week. And went back to my doctor, who said, okay, I can see what the problem is this. I'm going to assign you to a physiotherapist. Oh, don't worry about that. I get that. I can cover that cost as well. So the additional cost or the additional time is the thing that we've taken away from that person's worry.
The key thing you say there, I think, is we did what we can. I think nowadays, right, whatever industry you're in, the salary is the consistent thing you will get in every job that you go to. But the stuff that's over and above that is now going to make the difference, because, I mean, depending on who you are and what you need in life, you know, there are lots of people now, some of the latest data is showing that people would actually rather some additional benefits over pay rises, because if that solves another problem for them. And one of the challenges we saw, especially when I was writing the book, was doing what we can, but what does good look like? On a list of things I should be doing, how far can I take that? What do my resources and funding allow me to tick off? And so we ended up, one of the last chapters of the book is about a tool I created with my team at Benefex, which is the Wellbeing Progress Index. So the book effectively became the evidence base for this tool, which was we took 200 to 600 studies in various different guises and filtered those into a series of evidence-based questions, which were basically saying to employers, do you do this thing, yes or no? If you don't do it, your action is to do that thing, and that will reflect in your score. But then we basically surface your score alongside your industry and globally and your country, so you can start to see some kind of benchmarking. And we break those scores then down to things like management style, leadership, communications, and financial well-being, emotional well-being, physical well-being, and give you all these kind of indicators. We've opened that up so anyone can use it, so people can just contact Benefex. They can just email hello@benefex.com, and we can give people access to that for free. But part of that is what does well-being look like? So I think anyone today, whether they think they do well-being really well or they do really poor, they think they do well-being really poorly, could go through that, answer lots of questions, and we'd be able to say, well, according to what the evidence says, if you do more of these things, your people are more likely to do well. You're not doing as bad as you thought. And suddenly there's now a roadmap of the things that we think you should do. And spoiler alert, quite a lot of what we talked about today are featured on the things you should be doing. But that's one of the first times I think I've seen, and lots of people who've used it told us that you've encapsulated what should we be doing more of, and how do I go through this list and tick off and create myself a kind of a map for my strategy and what should be included in my strategy. And I think we need more of that, because as you mentioned at the start, before now, every voice that was telling you to do something was doing that from a position of, because I want you to buy my product. And our index, if you buy some of our products, your score will go up, but less than a third of what we recommend is actually going out and buying stuff. Most of it is decisions you need to make internally about additions or policy changes and how you're trying to manage. And a really interesting one is about kind of creating a hub or home for wellbeing, as you mentioned, because our own data backs up the fact that even in organizations where you have a really progressive approach to wellbeing, to cater for a large, diverse workforce, you end up with a lot of stuff and a lot of options. And so suddenly navigating that becomes really challenging. So giving people you've got one place to go, all the support you'll get is in that place, is cutting through a lot of the noise.
It makes a difference, and we see it in our data where people don't know where to go and they don't know what they've got. It's almost like you just don't bother having it. If you're not communicating it well, move it away. One of the things we did within our surveys was, if somebody was asking a chunk of wellbeing questions, or they were doing a full-on wellbeing survey, then what we've put in is the ability to put pages in to that survey and be able to signpost somebody who says, maybe you just ask them mental health questions. At the end of that, you can say, not before it because it's leading, but at the end of it, you can say to somebody, thank you for taking part in this section, et cetera, et cetera. Here's a link to our Wellbeing Hub. Here's a link to our EAP. Here's a link to our policies. Here's a link to where you can reach out to mental health first aider team. Here's a link where you can go to the health and safety team, and being able to actually, when somebody's interacting with you, take the opportunity to help communicate, take the opportunity to help deliver some of that stuff. And I know we've got 5 minutes, but the thing, if wellbeing's a team sport, and why haven't we fixed it yet? It's a bit leading in terms of why haven't we fixed it yet. I think it's always moving. Yeah. And I think genuinely, almost that next level of maturity is, why haven't we fixed it yet? Because we haven't got to that level where we are working on the environmental causal factors of wellbeing issues in our business, and we're not looking at the evidence. And I think exactly what you were saying around Benefex doing, the thing that we're trying to get people to do now is to go, what are the things that you can influence and you can control? What are the things that you as an organization can have a hand in? What's important to you right now? And it might not be, and that's an outcome, that's great. But actually, you can't focus on retention and not think about well-being. You can't look at advocacy and not look at well-being. All of our data tells us that how you're treated at work, your intentional well-being strategy will lead through to those outcomes that you're looking for anyway. Retention, advocacy, motivation to perform, safety culture. So you want people to be safe, you have to instill behavioural safety. And I'd love to see more IT teams getting involved in the wellbeing conversation, the people who choose tech, set budgets.
Yeah.
The health and safety by default, the health and safety teams are probably the most qualified people in an organization. If you have them, they're trained. You know, they go and have training on safety and well-being. So let's get them as part of the conversation. Let's make more round tables in an organization, and the suppliers, bring them in, because we've got to solve an organization's problem. Go where the problem is and fix it, not here's a homogenous well-being proposition for you. And I think if I was to summarize, I'm going to ask you in a minute, why haven't we fixed it yet? I think it's because we're still on a bit of a journey we're mitigating the impact, not solving the problem just yet. That's probably my view on that, but I'd love to hear your view as we close.
Yeah, I would agree. You know, it's been around for a long time, but it hasn't had the C-suite attention that it's needed until really recently. And that's pretty much been buoyed by the pandemic. And I think the pandemic itself advanced adoption and understanding of workplace well-being in the masses probably by about 10 years. So we were really thrust into this situation where we had to kind of panic, and people bought things and people made decisions that would see them through the pandemic, and are now probably quietly reflecting on, was that the decision to make? Was that policy might have seen us through the pandemic, but will that actually be adequate for the next 3-5 years? And I think businesses are also getting to grips with, how far do we want to go? What kind of a business do we want to create? And I think that's absolutely fine as well. You know, if you're saying, I don't want to be progressive, but I want to make sure that I'm doing the right things, and then I see my responsibility as stopping there, I think that's fine. You know, not every business is going to become really progressive in its attitude. One of the biggest indicators of this happening is, you know, I've been saying since about 2014 that you should put the employee at the center of your business and everything else will start to fall into place. Last year, Edelman's measurement of who the most important stakeholder in a business is for the first time tipped over in the favor of the employee. So 40% of people globally say the employee is now more influential to business success than its customers, shareholders, or investors. You saw the Business Roundtable in the US, a collection of 200 of the largest CEOs representing Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, Walmart, all these big US businesses. Their redefined statement of purpose, this is just literally a couple of months ago, basically said, we've got to do more to support the employee. We've got to pay them better. We've got to offer them benefits that support their lives and take care of their well-being. Jeff Bezos, ex-CEO of Amazon, Amazon unreservedly put the customer at the center of everything they do and became a poster child for how not to treat employees in many ways. You started the media showing, statements from employees and pictures from employees who had to urinate in bottles because they were afraid to leave their workstations. In his swan song letter to investors last year, Jeff Bezos said, we put the customer at everything we do, and that was the right thing to do, but it shouldn't have been at the expense of employees. The Business Roundtable said, we put shareholders first. We shouldn't have done that at the expense of employees. Employees should be on parity with shareholders. So it feels like we're just tipped over this. We've got used to it. We've been trying to understand it. And we're now saying, do you know what? Even in the darkest of places, people are starting to say, do you know what? Maybe we got this wrong, or maybe we have to put employees at the center of what we do. And so I think people are now, as we're just, the roller coaster is about to kind of gather speed, people are quickly trying to understand, okay, so what do we actually need to do? What is well-being at work? And as you've mentioned, it's a journey that's ever evolving, because the next pandemic is going to be around the corner, the next cost of living crisis. More people will get marginalized. There'll be more diversity entering the workforce. People will be working longer. People are coming back from retirement into the workforce. So, all these different changes are bringing new problems and challenges with them. And so I don't think we will ever stop. It will always be a constant evolution. It's a moving target, which is why I think starting to commit to it now and be a bit more experimental and do lots of the stuff we've talked about today is the way that we will get. If you're on that journey and you're getting to grips with it, you're going to be in a much, much stronger place than those who are just clambering around and buying stuff because they're trying to create a strategy overnight.
It feels like an amazing point to end. Thank you so much for joining. For everyone who has who's joined or signed up to join, we will send across a link to Gethin's LinkedIn, to the stuff Gethin was talking about at Benefix. We'll send some information on that as well. on how you can access that. A couple of links to Gethin's books, of course, and information about what we do. So thank you so much for everyone who has joined us. Thank you, Gethin. It has been amazing as ever.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, Nick. Thanks to the team as well. And thanks to everyone for joining.